straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. The Parkland school shooter penalty phase trial.
Nicholas just didn't have the social skills.
Witnesses give a closer look at the gunman's childhood. And
you said that it was consistent with a traumatic event involving the neck and face at or around the time of death.
Correct.
Hear forensic anthropologist expert testimony as an Ohio man stands trial for murder. Plus, opening statements are presented in Florida versus Trevor Summers.
Elisa Summers, while her hands are tied, she's able to stop it as he is trying to pull that rope and strangle her around her neck.
Gather the facts, put the facts together with the law, make a conclusion if a crime was committed, what crime that was.
And later, the federal trial of R. Kelly. A mother confesses she was scared for her life after being threatened by the singer. Law and Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everybody to Law and Crime Daily. I'm your host Allison Hall, in for Brian Buckmeyer. As the defense continues its case in the Parkland school shooter penalty phase trial, focus shifts from the gunman's biological mother to his adoptive mother. In February 2018, a then 19-year-old gunman opened fire at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida. 17 people were killed and 17 more were injured. In October of last year, the gunman pleaded guilty to all charges. It's now up to a Broward County jury to determine whether he receives life in prison or is sentenced to death. The defense began its case on Monday, presenting an opening statement. Attorneys highlighted the difficult upbringing the defendant had, including a biological mother who continued to use drugs and alcohol while pregnant. On Tuesday, testimony shifted to the defendant's adoptive mother, Linda Cruz, who died several months before the shooting. A close friend described developmental and social delays in the defendant's early years, saying his adoptive mother did not want to seek treatment.
Did his lack of development and some of his behavior concern you?
Yes.
Okay. So what did you do with your concerns?
Well, as a mother, you don't want to go and tell another mother, but she was my friend. And so it actually first came up that Roger noticed it because Roger had 4 children and grandchildren, and he had brought it up at my home. He wanted Linda to bring him to like a specialist and stuff. Linda didn't see anything wrong.
She didn't what?
She didn't want to see anything wrong with him.
But that's not unusual, right?
No, it's not.
Okay. And when you would try to have these conversations with her, was she receptive?
No.
Joining us today is co-host Terry Austin and Los Angeles County Deputy Public Defender Philip Dube. Philip, let's start with you here. The defendant has admitted to all of these charges. Plus, of course, 17 people were killed. Do you think, despite the defendant's difficult childhood, the jury would actually decide in favor of the death penalty?
Well, Allison, it's a very subjective approach. Despite the expose of this troubled kid's childhood, in utero exposure to intoxicants and drugs, alcohol, and despite the special needs that he had in the school system and how mom, the education system, and the system in general failed him, 12 jurors are left with a very subjective balancing approach to decide if all the aggravating facts surrounding this case outweigh that traumatic mitigation. Is there a chance? Of course, but I believe that on this evidence, the aggravating factors are weighted much more heavily against the mitigation, but he only needs one juror to find that the aggravators do not outweigh the mitigators, and if so, he gets life without parole.
And Terry, the defendant's biological mother was a drug addict. Then he lost his adoptive mother 3 months before the shooting. Do you think that the loss of his adopted mother further impacted this defendant?
Allison, I definitely think so. When he lost his adopted mother, it was only a couple of months later that the shooting occurred. It definitely contributed to his downfall. No family is perfect. Linda and her husband, Roger, they definitely provided some stability, both financial and emotional. And even though Linda did not want to recognize the problems that Nicholas Cruz had, she eventually got him the help he needed. So it definitely hurt him.
We'll certainly be following along with this penalty phase trial as it continues. Let's head west now to Northern California, where we're hearing from the dive team that recovered the body of Kylie Rodney. The 16-year-old was last seen on August 6th at a party near Lake Tahoe. She texted her mother that she would soon return home, but never arrived. Her 2013 Honda CR-V was also missing. On Sunday, the Oregon-based rescue team Adventures with Purpose announced on its Facebook page that Rodney's body was found in the overturned SUV. On Monday, California law enforcement confirmed the vehicle inside the water was Rodney's, and on Tuesday confirmed the remains were also hers. So far, Rodney's manner of death has not been released, and the investigation is still ongoing. Law&Crime Network spoke with the diver who recovered the vehicle and body. He explains what it was like to make that discovery.
There's obviously a split second of disappointment because that's not how you wanted this story to end. But at the same time, it's also finally some answers to the disappearance of the missing person. And then you have to kind of mentally prepare yourself to go down and do the vehicle assessment to continue your task at hand to take notes as to the condition of the vehicle, if the windows are up, down, is the vehicle damaged, is there anything inside it, is there remains inside it, and that sort of thing. So it's there's a few moments there where emotionally you have to kind of hold it together and just keep focused at the task at hand.
Still ahead on Law&Crime Daily, opening statements are presented in the trial of Florida versus Trevor Summers. But first, the death of Emily Noble. Forensic experts explain the condition of her body when it was discovered in the woods. Welcome back. Heading now to Ohio, where jurors hear from an anthropologist involved in the investigation into the alleged staged suicide of Emily Noble, as her husband Matthew Moore stands trial for her murder. Moore reported his wife missing after her 52nd birthday in May 2020. Volunteer search parties looked for Noble over the next few months, though Moore reportedly never helped in the search. In mid-September, a group of 3 women found Noble's body in a wooded area near the couple's home, with a USB cord wrapped around her neck. Her body was so badly decomposed, investigators had to use dental records and DNA to confirm her identity. Investigators say her death was staged to look like a suicide. The following June, Moore was arrested and charged with her murder. Dr. Amanda Agnew examined the remains after Noble's body was found.
All of the blue arrows are indicating locations where a fracture was identified that was ante-mortem. So there was evidence of healing. The red arrow is indicating a location of perimortem trauma. So again, it has those jagged edges that can be seen there, and there's no indication of healing. The bioprofile indicated a middle adult female of European ancestry that sustained perimortem trauma to the neck and face, as well as had evidence of antemortem trauma and some minor systemic reactions in the bone throughout the skeleton.
And so specifically with regard to the perimortem trauma, you said that it was consistent with a traumatic event involving the neck and face at or around the time of death.
Correct.
Terry, let's start with you. The body of the victim was severely decomposed. Do you think that the prosecution could argue that Moore did not participate in the search because he did not want his wife's body to be found?
Listen, if I were the prosecution, I would definitely make that argument. Most spouses will participate in the search of their missing partner. So you have to imagine that maybe he doesn't want his wife to be found. I think it's very odd that he did not help. if he in fact killed his wife, he could leave her out there. They could make sure that the body was decomposed at that point. He could make sure that there's less evidence, less DNA. And so I think it would be much more difficult to determine the cause and manner of death at that point. So if I were the prosecution, I would definitely argue that.
And Philip, the doctor's testimony describes facial injuries, but couldn't the defense argue that those injuries occurred during the hanging if it was suicide?
Well, the only way they're going to be able to do that effectively is with an expert. Typically, the human tissue, the derma, the viscera, they will pre-mortem and even post-mortem just sort of malform and malshape and maybe even slip away from skeletal remains. But the skeleton itself remains intact unless there is some type of blunt force trauma inflicted pre-mortem or perhaps during the quote-unquote suicide or after death. It is very unlikely that an animal from the fauna of that region would have inflicted that type of harm because that type of velocity would have pulled the body down and would have been on the ground. It's not as if, not to sound crass, that somebody was trying to hit a piñata to break it open. The whole thing would have collapsed, but it was in fact found hanging. So it's very unlikely.
Thank you, Philip. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, it's week 2 of testimony in federal court, where R. Kelly stands trial for a string of sex crimes. Plus, hear opening statements from both sides as a Florida man stands trial for attempted murder. Welcome back. Opening statements are presented in the Florida trial of Trevor Summers as he faces charges for the 2017 attempted murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping of his estranged wife, Elisa Mathewson. The incident began Friday, March 10th of that year after months of conflict between the couple. The September before, Summers had pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and was awaiting sentencing. A few months later, amid divorce proceedings, a judge barred the couple from seeing each other. But Summers allegedly told their then 14-year-old daughter he wanted to reconcile and he needed some alone time with his wife. Authorities say Summers had planned a murder-suicide and had convinced his children into letting him into Mathewson's house. Over the next 3 days, Summers allegedly held Mathewson captive in her home and the backseat of her SUV. Prosecutors say he attempted to kill her twice, once with a pillow and again later with a rope. It all came to an end when a witness saw the SUV and followed them, leading to finding Mathewson and the arrest of Summers. Prosecutors explained in their opening statement Tuesday that Summers confessed to what happened that weekend.
He writes letters in the back of the victim's vehicle, letters that you will get to see, a confession letter of what took place on March 11th, 2017 at her home, writes a surrender of his parental rights, writes letters that Ms. Summers is to get his car, the money in his bank account, and his home, and a letter that he wrote to his children. A letter that he wrote before the second attempted homicide incident. You will get to see that letter. You will get to make the determination what kind of letter that was.
Summers' defense attorney argued there was no motive behind the allegations against his client, telling the jury they will have to decide if what actually happened was a crime.
You're going to leave with a feeling of despair in hearing this very tragic story about a family that fell apart. The story that Ms. Johnson gave you is a story. It is the state's theory of what happened. There are times, she says, the testimony from Mrs. Summers will be that she was tied up, that she couldn't get away, that she was forced, that she had no alternative. When you get to the sexual assault, you have to make some decisions about the distinctions between consent and acquiescence. Most certainly, an individual who is being abducted and decides to do anything to stay alive, that would be acquiescence, and I would agree that that's not consent. But the question is that the situation in this case.
Philip, this case boils down to a he said, she said, but if the children testify and support their mother's version, do you think that will be enough for a conviction?
Oh, Allison, attempt crimes are some of the most difficult to defend because obviously your victim lives long enough to testify against the defendant. In this particular case, the defense is going to have to show a darn good reason why the kids would lie. Why would they make this up? Were they alienated against him by the mother? Was their family who had it in for him and just are doing whatever they can to take him down? But moreover, did the kids give prior inconsistent statements perhaps to the police or family members or neighbors? And moreover, were any of the wife's injuries, if any, consistent with how the kids say they were, how they went down, if you will, how they were inflicted, how she even got them? But short of that, I think it is a tall order for this defendant.
Indeed it is. And Terry, during opening statements, defense counsel told the jury that they could decide the child neglect charges for themselves. Do you think that's the defendant conceding that charge?
It sure sounded as though he were conceding it. Listen, the fact that those children were left alone and the 14-year-old drove 25 miles by herself and the 3-year-old was alone, all of that under Florida law certainly could add up to child neglect because it doesn't show that there is a reasonable care of someone who is in your welfare.
Right. It's certainly a heartbreaking story, and we'll continue following along as it develops. When we come back, we head to Illinois for the federal trial of singer R. Kelly. Why the mother of an alleged victim says she lied to a grand jury about Kelly's abuse. Welcome back. The defense presented their closing argument late Tuesday afternoon in Vanessa Bryant's Los Angeles lawsuit as she sues the county over photos taken at the crash site where her husband and daughter died. The 2020 helicopter crash killed Vanessa's husband, Kobe Bryant, their daughter Gianna, and 7 others. The lawsuit claims close-up photos were taken of their remains and that those photos were distributed among first responders and even shared with members of the public on several occasions. Bryant says this caused emotional distress and violated their family's privacy. Tuesday morning, jurors heard the final moment of testimony from the acting chief of the LA County Fire Department. He said he didn't know the now retired captain who photographed remains at the site and that he never instructed him to take photos, opposite of what the captain testified last week. Several planned expert witnesses didn't end up testifying, including a psychiatrist aimed at explaining the plaintiff's emotional state. Once the defense rested Tuesday afternoon, the judge decided not to wait until Wednesday to start closing arguments. So far, there's been no indication as to the amount the plaintiffs are seeking. Also in celebrity legal news, a mother testifies her family feared for their lives after a tense meeting with R&B singer R. Kelly more than 2 decades ago. This comes as the 55-year-old convicted sex offender stands trial in Illinois for 13 federal sex crime charges. Back in 2008, Kelly was acquitted by a Cook County, Illinois jury for creating a video of himself having sex with a 14-year-old girl. At the time, the girl and her parents denied involvement and did not testify. Now the alleged victim's mother says her family lied to a grand jury out of fear for their safety. The woman using the pseudonym Susan says she was threatened by Kelly in the year 2000. She told jurors, quote, "We feared for our lives and we were intimidated and we just wanted to make sure my daughter was safe." Her daughter, using the name Jane, testified last week. She told jurors she was the 14-year-old girl shown in the explicit video and that she had sex with Kelly hundreds of times while underage. Philip, let's start with you here. Kelly faces additional state charges in Illinois and Minnesota. Do you think he should try to reach a universal plea deal resolving all of these charges?
Oh, that's a tough question, Allison. I think a lot of it hinges on what some of the pretrial and the what I call the in limine rulings are in that Illinois courtroom. So, for example, is the judge going to allow evidence of all the federal conduct for which he was recently convicted into evidence in the state trial. If that comes in, that could be so unduly prejudicial that the jury won't believe the defense. Now, on the other hand, you have complaining witnesses here who are ready, willing, and able to take the stand and tell the jury what R. Kelly did to them years ago. But on the flip side of that, they also lied to a similar body of jurors who heard evidence from them under oath that it didn't happen. So at some point, I think a jury could throw its hands up in the air and say, we don't know who to believe. But I guess the question for R. Kelly is, should he go big or go home? And it's really his call depending on what his end game is.
And Terry, Kelly is charged with 13 counts in this case, including obstruction of justice tying back to the 2008 acquittal. Why do you think the prosecution is focusing on that particular charge?
I think that charge is important because obstruction of justice is very serious. When you intimidate a witness and they don't get on that stand, you are affecting the system, the justice system in whole, and you have to protect those witnesses. They have to be able to come forward. If they're intimidated, if they're in fear of their lives, the system is not going to work. So I think the prosecution here wanted to make sure that they sent a message, and they did with making that charge.
Thank you both. Thank you for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.